Hi, welcome back. We are going to be talking about the moral law for the rest of our video series. The moral law is an attempt to ground universal moral principles in human nature. And you can test each one of these to see, is it true that these are grounded in human nature so that it's clear, everybody could know it, it's easily knowable. It's comprehensive. It covers all aspects of choice and decision making, and it is critical. It's a matter of life or death, and not necessarily physical life and death, but spiritual life or death, intellectual life or death. And remember, we are trying to give rational justification for the answer to the question, what is the good? So today we're going to talk about the good. One more piece I want to draw your attention to, and this is on an outline that's provided for you, the Natural Moral Law outline. This is Moral Law 1, Moral Absolute and Metaphysical Absolute. So if you notice on the outline, the moral law, each one is organized in a way that will help you to study it, learn it, and see how it is rooted in human nature and how it's applied. So we have 5 aspects. First, the origin of this moral law. Second is the nature of this moral law. Third is the law itself. Fourth are some applications of the law, and these applications are not exhaustive. They're representative. We could apply it in further ways. And then fifth is the consequences of this law. Consequences are where we talk about a matter of life and death. So there are positive consequences and negative consequences. So if you follow this law, you should expect these consequences. If you don't follow this law, you should expect these consequences. And these consequences are inherent because it's about human nature. And remember, there's a distinction between a moral law and a legal code. So we're talking about moral laws, not legal laws, although there is a relationship between them. You can have a legal code that is immoral, or you could have things that are moral that aren't in the legal code. So let's begin our discussion of Moral Law 1. And this will be some review because it's about the good, and we've been talking about the good already. So it begins this way. The first moral law is about the good and the ground of the good. It's about the good and the real, or what is eternal. And we've had a discussion about what is eternal already in a series previously. It's about the moral absolute and the metaphysical absolute. So remember our house. We talked about the house previously. We have our ground, which is our epistemology. How do we know? And the way we're going to pursue knowledge in ethics is through reason. We had a long talk about reason. Then we have our foundation. This is our metaphysics. Is there a metaphysical absolute? Meaning, is it the case that everything is one thing, or can we distinguish between things such that there's a transcendent reality by which we can make distinctions between good and evil? And then the house is our ethics. And so you could think of the moral law as like the furnishings within your house. Your house has to have things inside to organize it. So think of the moral law as like the furnishings. And you don't have to believe these at all. You should test them. You should critically analyze them, see if it's true, see if it's rooted in human nature. So the origin. First, let's talk about the origin of this law. The good is grounded in human nature, in the reality of choice. So think about this. Is it a universal that everyone who's capable of making choices does make choices? Is choice a universal among rational beings? Choice assumes we have values. Values assumes the good or the highest value. And we've talked about this before. What is chosen is either chosen for its own sake or it's chosen for something else. And if it's chosen for its own sake, it's chosen because it is the good. And if it's chosen for something else, then it's chosen as a means to the good. So again, we're making a distinction between the good as the end and the means. So when we choose because it's a means to something else, or we choose because it is the end in itself. So think about that. Is that true? Okay, the nature of this law. The good is the end in itself, which we've talked about. It's chosen for its own sake, not for the sake of anything else. The good is the highest value, or the summum bonum. It is also the source of unity in ourselves and among people. So it is the moral absolute, meaning other aspects of ethics are relative to the good, like virtues relative to the good, happiness is relative to the good. So the good is the moral absolute. And we've also talked about this. The good is not virtue. Virtue is a means to the good. And we talked about different kinds of virtues in the past: moral, natural, and instrumental. We've also said the good is not happiness, but happiness is the effect of possessing what we believe is the good. We've also talked about this. The good is one. The good is the source of unity in each person and among people. And we can talk about this a little bit more. There's one good for each person. So do you have 10 goods like the new natural law theory thought, 10 basic goods? Or do you have one good? There's a little argument here. There's one good for each person. If there were more than one good for each person, there'd be no rational basis for choice. So if we had two competing equal views of the good, we would be stuck in indecision because we wouldn't have a reason to go with one over the other if they're equal. So think about that. You have one good, one ultimate value. Here's another argument. There is one good for all people. The good for you is the same as the good for me. I know you're objecting in your mind right now. No way. Well, think about it. If the good is based on human nature, the good for a being is based on the nature of a being. Let's back up. And the good for humans is based on human nature. There's one human nature. We're rational, political animals. So there's one good for all human beings. Okay, let's try that again. There's the good for a being is based on the nature of a being. The good for humans is based on human nature. Human nature is that we're rational political animals and we're fundamentally rational. Therefore, there's one good for all rational beings. Okay, now test it, see if it's valid and sound, and then you can object. All right, so there's one good for each person, and there's one good for all people. I just went over that argument. That looks like a nice question for a quiz, doesn't it? The good is clear. It's based on human nature, and human nature is easily knowable. We said it's self-evident that we're thinking things, we're rational, and so it's easily knowable what a human is. So it's easily knowable what the good for humans is. And the good is objectively clear. It's knowable by all people who can be held morally responsible apart from cultural background. So it doesn't matter where you were born in the world, you could know what a human is, and so you could know what is good for a human. Now this is where it gets a little controversial. The good is based on the real, and this is where people disagree. Remember we talked about human personality. We said we're rational political animals. This is the source of unity. This is universal. But then once we go to the next level, presuppositions, different basic beliefs, people disagree. So we can say there's one good for all people and people disagree over the good. Those two statements are both true because one's view of the good is based on one's view of human nature, and one's view of human nature is based on their view of what is real. So if you think matter is all that exists, humans don't have a soul, there is no God, then your view of human nature will be that humans are a material being only, and the good for humans would be based on that. You have maybe 80 years if you're lucky, so figure out what the point is for those 80 years before, you die. So if you think, no, humans have a soul and the soul continues after death, then you're going to have a different view of the good life, right? So people differ over what is real or eternal, and that's a previous conversation that needs to be had. And we did have that conversation in the last series. And in that conversation, I tried to argue that it's clear that something is eternal and matter exists and matter's not eternal, and the soul exists and the soul is not eternal. So we got to some other being that is spirit that is eternal, and that's what people call God. So what is eternal brought into existence or created? What is not eternal? The creator is God. Now, you don't have to agree with that conclusion, but you should go back through the steps and see why you don't agree. At what point do you disagree in that line of argumentation? Okay, so here's the moral law for this one. God, as creator of human nature, is the determiner of good and evil for humans. Why? Because if humans aren't self-created, we didn't make ourselves, and if nature didn't make us, then we are ultimately created beings, and we didn't make our nature. Our nature is created, and so we don't get to determine what's good for our nature. It's already determined for us by act of our being what we are. So that's going to be the major dispute in ethics. Do you get to say what the good is? Or does the good come as an aspect of your being, which you didn't make? Okay, so this is probably the number one human problem, right? I get to say what the good is. Okay, here are some applications of this moral law. Theism, which is belief in God, is opposed to all forms of non-theism. And all forms of non-theism would be things like material monism, which says all that exists is matter and matter is eternal. Spiritual monism, which says all that exists is spirit and spirit is eternal. Dualism, which says matter is eternal and the soul is eternal. And we've briefly touched on these in the previous discussion where we gave an argument that only some is eternal. So non-theism is any kind of belief that doesn't have a God the creator. Now, this idea of objective clarity, that it's clear to reason what the good is opposed to all forms of skepticism, which says nothing is clear. Nothing is clear to reason, and to fideism, which is a religious version of this we've talked about, which is belief in whatever without proof or without understanding. It could be religious belief or it could be secular belief, non-religious belief. Belief without proof is fideism. So clarity is against skepticism and fideism. And that's objectively. Subjective clarity, meaning in the individual can know. This is opposed to emotivism, that at root humans are not rational beings, they're emotional beings, they're sentimental beings, or voluntarism. Humans are mostly will, based on the will. And remember in our history lesson, as we move towards that fourth column, when we've given up reason, we move into emotivism and voluntarism, emphasis on the will to power in order to get what we want. And usually it's to satisfy our desires, which is connected to our feelings. So this view is opposed to the view that feelings and will are independent of and can be opposed to what we understand. There's no split between knowing and doing. And this is something Socrates held to. If you know the good, then you'll do the good. This is opposed to the view that knowledge is not sufficient for morality. That knowledge of the truth does not set one free. So the truth about the good should set you free from falsehood about the good, which is usually our own view of the good. You know, you can have a false view of the good. You can determine the good for yourself, and it turns out that wasn't really the good, and you're harming yourself, in fact. And you could be set free from that harm by actually knowing what is the good. Okay, there's another view that this is opposed to autonomy, self-law, the law determined by ourself. So this is a problem with humans. We want to determine the moral law for ourselves apart from God. It's opposed to a view called heteronomy. And heteronomy means other, a source other. And it's really opposed to the idea that the law is given to us outside of our nature. This is saying, no, we derive the law from our nature as human beings. So this is opposed to the view that the law is from an external source, independent of reason. This is maybe the Bible or Scripture or the Ten Commandments, something like that. So it's opposed to the view that the law is only known through special revelation, which is from Scripture. And if you recall, in the third column on our history list, when we started talking about nominalism and divine command theory, we saw this creeping in, that we couldn't know the law apart from God telling us. And so in the next one, we'll see divine command theory is also opposed here. This moral law is opposed to positivism, which is the moral law given by an arbitrary source, a positive source. Maybe it's God, maybe it's the king, but it's outside of human nature. So do we submit to a law made up by humans or arbitrarily given by God outside of human nature? No, the moral law given in human nature is opposed to the divine command theory that the law is arbitrary or merely positive. God said it, that settles it. And whatever God commands is good apart from human nature. So this would mean something like God can say, adultery is wrong on Mondays and Wednesdays, but all the other days of the week it's okay, right? That would just be arbitrary. Why would adultery be wrong at all? It would have to be connected to human nature somehow. Okay, teleology, remember the laws focused on the good, the end in itself, is opposed to deontology, where the good is duty, and consequentialism, the results of action, like happiness. So we've already talked about that. So this moral law is teleological, goal-oriented, focusing on the good. Now, what are the consequences of this moral law? Remember, there's a positive side and a negative side. Moral evil is a denial of one's nature as a rational being. We've talked about this. In moral evil, one neglects, avoids, resists, and denies reason in the presence of what is clear about God. So if someone presents an argument like it did earlier, that it's clear that matter exists and matter is not eternal, the soul exists and the soul is not eternal, therefore some other being, God, exists, and the person doesn't want to see that, then this is what we're talking about. The neglecting, avoiding, resisting, denying reason in the presence of what is clear. An argument's been presented. In order to avoid that argument, you have to resist the person or deny reason in itself, which is what Nietzsche said to do, right? He said we should kill reason. If reason leads to God, kill reason, right? The consequence of the denial of reason is spiritual death. Individually, it brings meaninglessness, boredom, and guilt. And we've talked about this. Less and less meaning, which will lead to boredom. And we have to fill the boredom. We fill it with excess. And then we feel guilt because we've wasted our lives, our money, our time, our efforts. So that's an inherent consequence. It goes like this. No reason, no meaning. Okay? Corporately. So imagine a lot of people narding, not using their reason. Corporately, it brings the death of relationships between people. It brings the death of institutions. And it brings the death of cultures. So we're seeing in our day institutional, I would say, collapse. At least institutional distrust. And you should ask, is that because of spiritual death? How much are we encouraged to use reason to see what is clear in our day? How many people are doing that? So it's an inherent consequence. Spiritual death is present and inherent in moral evil. It's not imposed and it's not future. It's nothing that God's doing to humans from the outside, and it's not like dying and going to hell in the future. It's present and it's now. So spiritual death is a reality, and it happens when we don't act according to our nature. Well, the opposite is spiritual life. So the positive side is to affirm what is clear about God brings a life full of meaning. And full of meaning means meaning for the individual, meaning for the relationships in that individual's life, and in the community and in the culture and society and civilization. So we want that. We want fullness of life, more and more meaning. And if the world is created and there are realities to be known in the world, then there is meaning to be grasped, things to be known. And human beings are meaning-seeking beings. We need meaning. And so if we seek after meaning, we will find it. It's there to be discovered. So that is Moral Law 1. And you can see there's an organization to it. We'll call it ONLAC. Origin, Nature, Law, Application, Consequences. And each moral law is organized in that way. The next moral law is going to talk about thinking and the order for thinking. And again, it will be organized according to ONLAC. So I'm going to pause here and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.